We are live in the Storycraft Cafe. I am your host, Hank Garner, and today I am super excited to have Mark Helprin on the show with me. Mark has a fantastic, amazing new book. It's called The Oceans and the Stars. Here is a pre release copy that I have been so fortunate to get to read. It publishes this October, and this is a book that you definitely don't want to miss. Welcome to the show, Mark.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be here.
I'm excited to have you, Mark. I have to start our conversation by saying that Winter's Tale is one of my top 5 favorite books of all time. It has meant so much to me over the last couple of decades, and it's such an honor and privilege to get to speak with you today.
Well, thank you. Let me ask you a question. How old are you?
I am 51. I'll be 52 this
Okay.
fall.
See, that's very interesting because I'm 76, and I came out with Winter's Tale in 1983 when I was 40, nearing 50. So you were quite young then. You must have
Yes.
been in 1983. How old were you?
I was 12, almost 13.
Well, you see, it influenced you as a young child, or
Yeah,
I don't know when you read it, but
yeah,
obviously it's from your youth.
yeah, I actually discovered it, a little later. I was probably in my 20s when I discovered
Uh-huh.
it,
But
and
still
then
young.
the film, came along later, and it's a completely different animal, but, the
Yes, yes, it's a completely different animal. And now perhaps your listeners should know that when you sign a movie contract, have a thing which is called, and I shall illustrate it, a clawback, which means that if you speak to the press, and you are the press in this instance, and you make derogatory comments about the movie, they will pull back the money that they gave you. So that's just as a point of information. But let us be content with the judgment that the movie was a completely different animal.
yeah, it is
Woof,
not that
woof,
the movie is
woof,
terrible
woof,
per
woof,
se,
woof,
it's
woof.
different.
Yeah, it's
I'm
much.
sorry, I didn't hear you, Mark.
I said woof. I'm just,
Um
there's a dog outside, and I was trying to talk to him.
I like to start conversations with a fun question sometimes. And what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Well, that's very interesting because when I was in second grade, my actually, so I was in third grade. Excuse me. In third grade, my third grade teacher, we're getting feedback here, aren't we?
Yes,
We had to stop that.
let's see if there's anything on my end.
You can edit this, right? You're
Yes,
editing.
yes, we will. I'll probably have to see if we can dial that in the post production. So
Okay. Okay with the feedback now? It's
it's
weird.
it's better.
Is it
Are
my
you
side?
using speakers on your end?
No.
No? Okay. Hmm. Well,
Oh, what I could do is put a earphones on and a mic.
if you have some, that might help.
Yeah, I do. Right here.
Okay.
Try that.
All right.
You
Can
hear
you
me?
still hear me, Mark?
Yeah. I think it's
Okay.
not working through here. It's just working through the mic,
Okay.
right? Yeah, it's not working. Okay.
Don't you love technology?
Yeah. I don't hear the feedback now. Right?
Okay. Well, hopefully has worked itself out. We'll see.
Maybe I should pick
Anyway, I'll clean it up in post production, and uh, we'll try to just suffer through. And in the meantime,
Okay, so I'll get right to the question. 3, 2, 1. When I was in third grade, my third grade teacher, who was the daughter of the Wilson Secretary of War. Now, these are people. This is a woman who was born in the 19th century for sure, and the woman who ran the school was one of the illegitimate daughters of General Philip Sheridan, the Civil War cavalry general. Her name was Sarah Sheridan. Sheridan had a lot of illegitimate daughters. Anyway, Miss Daniels, my third grade teacher, took me aside and had me dictate stories to her. And she wrote them down in third grade teacher's handwriting, and then sent them home with me. And Simon and Schuster offered me a 2-book contract. Truly, one for a novel, a children's novel, which would have been simply plagiarizing more or less Stuart Little, and the other for a children's history of Abraham Lincoln, were to be published by Golden Book. But my father refused to allow this because my mother had been a child actress and had been ruined by that kind, by being so precocious as a child. My father wanted to protect me, and he said, "No, don't do that." But I always told stories, and I think I knew that I was going to be a writer, probably from that age. And part of it is that if you think that you're not qualified for anything else, that's what you choose to do. Yeah. I can't really do anything else because I'm not very good with people. So
well, you have had a storied um, career path, if you will. You have been a writer for a number of decades, and you've collected life experiences along the way. And your new book, The Oceans and the Stars, I think I heard or read on your website that this was a book that you had wanted to write for quite a while, but you felt like you had not um, earned the life experience. Those are my words. Um, but talk a little bit, if you will, about the need for a writer to gather experience to be able to tell some of these intricate stories.
sure, I go into that what you mentioned in great detail in my website, which is amazing that I have a website given how old I am and that I don't like this kind of stuff. But um, it's called markhelprin.org, and right in the front there's quite an elucidation of what you're talking about. But in sum, um, when I was 20, I was in the British Merchant Navy, and I was on a ship called the MS Stonepool, and uh, some of the crew, or someone in the crew, told me the story of a ship called the Royal George, which was an English warship which sank in the 18th century. And when they pulled it up and they salvaged it, they discovered that there were hundreds of women on the ship who, they were essentially what they were courtesans, and or maybe family members. I don't know, but it was very unusual and it was a scandal. And as I was crossing the Atlantic at one point, uh, I thought, well, wouldn't it be great to write a novel or a novella about a ship in which all full of men, just men, and that what they're thinking about is the women that they left behind, that they were in love with, those women essentially are the reason that we are what we are. And I was 20. I tried to do it when I got home. I was, as I said in the little piece that I have on my website, in the snows of a Boston winter. I tried to write that novel, but I couldn't because I didn't know enough. I was 20 years old. However, after what, sea service, air service, infantry service, marriage, divorce, another marriage, which thank God has lasted for on 45 years now, raising children, um, the death of parents making a living, and even the, uh, the very deplorable um, involvement in the Dantean hell of, of politics inside the Beltway in Washington, had perhaps enough experience to write this book, which involves that kind of thing. It's not about young people. It's about, and the book is middle-aged people, really, who have some seasoning and some experience. Um, and middle-aged people now could be my children, but nonetheless, it's it's focused on that cohort, and it has, I hope, some of the wisdom that I may have gained in the intervening years, in the 56 years since I stood at the helm of that ship for long here, going across the ocean.
The subtitle of the book is A Sea Story, a War Story, a Love Story.
Yeah,
Your books are, traditionally hard to, pin down genre-wise, and I love that about your books. You're not afraid to tell a sweeping story that includes all of, the human condition, as it were. In our, uh, where we find, publishing today, we seem to be hyper fixated on genre and, staying within certain genre conventions. How do you think in terms of publishing today, and does that affect the types of stories that you write or want to write? Does the hyper fixation on genre and the, kind of categorizing, and putting authors in their little buckets, does that affect how you think of stories?
well, you hit it on the head, you see, because this is the thing. A novel, and I was brought up in the age-old traditions of literature, from the Romance, which has nothing to do with romantic and nothing to do with
Right.
even the Romantic movement in the 19th century, but rather goes all the way back to Adam, to the Bible and before the Bible, and a great pattern of literature in which you have a particular set of, I guess, conventions that dictate everything. You know, Dante is that, Tom Jones, and Hamlet, everything. There are a number of things. It would take me half an hour to go through them all. But in short, a novel is about many, many things. It's not boxed and contained, or Shakespeare would say, cabin, cribbed, and confined, as I believe that said. Um, it has to be about a lot of things. And these days, what you have in publishing, it's not just these days, it's been for quite a long time, you have what I would call gimmick books. Um, they're almost like magazine articles extended, like New Yorker magazine articles with simply extended and what they are is, for example, someone might get the idea, well, I'm going to write a book about a 19th century tobacco trader who gets a baboon. See, and then they hang the hook on that, and the whole thing is based on that premise, on that uh, gimmick. So that's not what a novel really should be like. A novel should be, first of all, it should take a lot, in my view, take great chances, chances of affirmation. In other words, things that you strongly believe in. You write about what you believe in. You write about what you love. And you don't do so I believe you should not do so in a fashionable sense. In other words, now we have novels, and they're all about, I don't know, race, sex, diversity, the environment, whatever the political atmosphere is of the day. People rush to fill that void and to sell books because that's what people are talking about. I may not sell any books. I mean, I do sell books, a lot of them, but this book may not sell. I don't know, because it isn't of the moment. It's anything but of the moment. But I hope that it would last, because it's in the tradition of things that do last. So is
Gotcha.
that a good answer? I
Yeah,
hope so.
absolutely. You mentioned the New Yorker, and you wrote for the New Yorker for quite a while, and you wrote
Yeah.
short fiction, and you published several collections of short fiction, and also essays, and different forms. Do you approach short fiction differently than you approach a novel? And when you first get an idea for a story, do you have an idea whether this is going to be a piece of short fiction or whether this is going to eventually be a novel? How do you get a feel for when a story idea comes to you, how to
That-
pursue it?
That's a great question. It really is. Uh, First of all, I started with the New Yorker, believe it or not, in 1963. I mean, that really takes me. And, it took me 6 years. I was 1963. I was 16. But of course, I had been offered a two-book contract for Simon and Schuster 8 years before, so I had the chutzpah to actually apply to the New Yorker, send them stories. So I started sending them stories, and finally began publishing them in 1969 when I was still in college, here in college, and I had a run with them for about 20 years. But then Mr. Shawn, who was the famous editor, died, and this is what happens in publishing and magazines and in everything. When the person who runs it dies, they bring in a different cast of characters, and there's a different emphasis. And I only had 20 years with them of publishing. But to answer your question more specifically, I much prefer writing short stories to novels. I think short stories. I think that I can do it better than a novel. My much better, whatever quality. That's number one. Number two, uh, I think it's a superior art form. However, to make a living, to go forward in the world, it turns out in the period in the last century in which I've been active and working, the way to do it is via novel. That's just the way it was. This book will be, I believe, and of course I could drop dead tomorrow. I don't know. 76 years old. I still do things that are very strenuous that might kill me. If I continue to live, then this book will be my second to last novel. I have one more that I'm working on now. I actually finished it. I go through about 12 drafts every book. So I'm on draft, I don't know, 3 or 4 now. So I have a way to go before I finish it. But that will be probably my last novel, because what I really would love to do is to just write stories. That's how I spend my delayed and belated retirement. I could have retired. I mean, some people, that's already 21 years ago for me. I'm retired. It's crazy. I should. But when I do, that's what I'll do. I hope to have a lot less stress and just write stories, because that's my first love. Um, and by the way, when I first started writing stories, just as I mentioned, when I was, 20, on that ship, um, I was unable to extend it into a novel. I couldn't. I didn't have enough to write about. But I did have ability, I think. I mean, at least it seemed to be being able to make something beautiful that was very small. But in extending it, I didn't know enough, so I couldn't extend it. That's what. By the way, if since we're on this kind of subject, um, I in that piece on my website that you referenced before, uh, one thing that I said is that I discovered that and not just a question of discovery, but I came to the belief that a novel can have lots of action in it. This novel, since it has a great deal of actions, it's a naval story. If you focus in on the cover, you see that wonderful. Um, and that's not because you mentioned that we're things in genre categories.
Mhm.
That great literature can have a great deal of action. Like the Iliad and the Odyssey.
Right.
And yeah, and then I mentioned that when I came home, I then discovered I then hadn't read Pushkin's book called His Daughter, which is a novella, which is tremendously suspenseful, great action, terrific action. And yet it's Pushkin, you know, beautiful writing. So you can have action and goings on and stuff in the tradition of Melville and Homer and etc. Uh, and that can still be literary, and you can combine it with um, language, with beautiful language, metaphor, simile, and sound, and not neglect those things. So, in other words, what I'm saying is that it, it can be like a combination of Tom Clancy without the nonsense of the atom bomb going off over the Champs Elysees or the merchandise market, unless the hero swings on a goes like Tom Cruise goes on a motorcycle from one building to another. That's nonsense, really, when you think about it. And that will not last. That's just gimmicks, special effects. Have great action mixed with beautiful writing. That's what anyway. That's what I tried to do with this book.
We've got a great question from Ken, who says, "Your stories take thrilling and unexpected turns, but I never got lost. You seem to have an internal meter that knows just when to pull it in. How do you know what to keep and what to throw out?" So I guess this is, would come to the second, third draft that you mentioned earlier. When after you get that first draft out, do you then take a critical eye back over the story structure? And like you said, how do you determine what is essential to stay and what could be better served by pulling it out?
Okay, that's a great question. Um, when I was young, I used to love to write, and I didn't like to edit. With every passing year, I like editing more and more until I actually like editing a lot better than writing, which is really weird. I like writing too, but uh, editing is more satisfying and more fun. And you can in a sense you can almost do more in with good editing than you can when you initially write. And that's part of the reason that I do 12 drafts. And the other thing is, how do you know what to leave in and what not to leave in? You see those books behind me? That's training. That's
Mhm.
training because from a very early age, I just read and read and read and read and read. And then I had, unfortunately, a very rigorous formal education. Uh, in the, I probably went to every prestigious university in the world. I really did. It's ridiculous. I went to Harvard College, Harvard Graduate School, Oxford, Princeton, Columbia, and Stanford. I mean,
You
it
tried to
was
hit them all,
ridiculous.
didn't you?
Yeah, I tried to hit them all, uh, and it was painful. It was really painful, and I was not made for it. And I didn't get along with anybody or anything. But so thank God I've left that behind. But it did have some effect in that I think of a branding iron from the old West. They heat it up and it's all red, and then they brand the cow. Well, this cow was branded with all those books back there, and that's the model that you have. If you look at great literature, then you internalize it. If you have the rigorous enough training and involvement with it. So my advice would be to read and to edit. There's a point, however, where there's too much, you know. And then here's another thing: when other people, uh, that is, editors, copy editors, um, whoever involved in the book, start putting in their 2 cents, that's good. Have a good person once, one go around, once, and it's the same, by the way, with political speech writing. You write the speech, and I've done this, unfortunately, for to presidential candidates. I never took any money for it, not one penny. I just did it at the public service. You write it and you share it with the candidate. The minute someone else starts to put their 2 cents in, you forget it. It will be ruined. Same thing with what they call the editorial process to the publisher. You have a good editor, let the editor give you advice and make line editing too. This doesn't account for copy editing. Copy editing is more technical. They fix the spelling and punctuation if you got it wrong and fact checking, whatever. But in terms of line editing, language, and the overall structure of the thing, one go around from an external person, more than that, and it will be ruined. So that's how I will work anyway. But for yourself, as many editings as you want. But when you feel, if you do get to the point where you feel that it hurts and you don't know if it's not clear what should be done, because you can't get to the point where if you look at a sentence or a paragraph, you don't know immediately what would make it much better, and you shouldn't. So I do it, and it takes me usually, all told, about 12 go rounds, and that includes feedback from the editor and the copy editor. But that's part of the key, and you can't necessarily do this if you're young. You see, a young person is not always suited for that kind of activity. For instance, when I was in graduate school, my advisor, who then became a very friend, family friend, he's been dead for almost 20 years, said to me, "You can't understand this because you're not old enough." And I saw, I thought I was hot stuff. I was at Harvard Graduate School and I went to a PhD, which I never got. And because I went into the Army and then I got married and I had a child. So, but he said, you can't. I thought, well, that's ridiculous because I'm so smart. I'm so terrific. Here I am. I could understand anything. No, 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 no. You have to live before you understand certain things. That's the way it is. You may understand it in theory. That doesn't cut it. He was absolutely right. So when I give advice about editing, there's a limit when you're young to how much you can edit because your is not yet suited to that. But it will be if you can manage to stay alive.
Well, that's the trick, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's part of it. It's part of
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
Well, speaking of that, because you do have novels that are well loved and that have garnered a massive following. Winter's Tale is a perfect example because you published that in 1983,
Right.
and now you have almost, well, I guess this year is 4 decades of life experience after that. Do you ever think about novels that you've written and published previously and think on those in terms of the life experience that you do have now? And if you could go back and change a work, would you? And if so, how would you approach it?
I'm sure that I would change it radically. Maybe not the overall structure of might, but particularly writing. Now, here's a funny thing. I have never read anything that I've written after it's been published. So I guess some people do. I don't do that. The last time I read Winter's Tale was in the year before it was published. And I went through the last go round on it. So that was 40 some odd years, 41 years, 41 years. Yeah. And so I never looked back in that respect. I'm sure that I would change everything in terms of line editing anyway, if not the structure. And also, I think you don't always have to think that the books that you've written are so great. Think, well, that one was not so good. I'm not particularly fond of Winter's Tale myself, as I remember it. I prefer other things, particularly shorter fiction that I've written. That's okay. I mean, it's not up to me, is it? For instance, you know, um, when when um, when art was scientized in the 19th century, essentially when science triumphed because it could do all kinds of amazing things. We eventually got the flu, we went to the moon, we cured diseases, et cetera, et cetera. So science jumped into the catbird seat, and art largely started to imitate it. See, it became more rational than emotional. Uh, it became more studied than impulsive. The Romantics were actually reacting to the scientization of art and the banishment of myth and emotion in literature and in painting, etc. But when that happened, you got all these artists every type who are explaining everything to everybody. Notice that? The architects will say, well, this echoes this and that echoes that, and that shows this is a, but you shouldn't have to explain yourself. It should be apparent. Why? Because it should be written in the language of nature. It should be written in the language that we all understand because we're subject to the same constraints. And you can uh, rules and laws. For example, you can't, if you don't have enough, a certain amount of oxygen, you die. If there's a certain high temperature, you die. If the temperature is too low, you die. If you don't get certain nutrition, you die. You are limited in terms of your muscular power. You're limited in terms of your speed. You're limited in terms of how far you can see, or what parts of the spectrum, the electromagnetic spectrum, you can actually see. A bee can see much more than we can. It can see other colors, etc. Um, these limitations are part of what make our humanity, and they give us, in a sense, a set of rules and a set of principles by which we can judge things that don't have to be explained in theory. You see, so what I'm trying to say is that you're you when in writing a book, this is what I do, and I imagine it's been done in the past. You rely upon that. You try to make the most beautiful and true representation of what you know, rather than moving according to a set of rules that were essentially derivative of the scientization of art. And that's why, for instance, I'm not crazy about the modern criticism, because it's formulaic and theoretical, and it's abandoned the very, I could use the word felicitous and wonderful rules of nature that we all have within us, and they're accessible to everybody because we're all subject to the same limitations. I don't know why I'm saying that, but so.
Mark, one thing that I love to ask people is that I am fascinated by where stories begin, and I don't mean in the trite sense that people ask authors all the time, "Where do you get your ideas from?" Because ideas are everywhere, but there is something about that idea that stands out from the rest, and just won't allow you to let it go. Um, in one moment, a story like the oceans and the stars does not exist. But then either an idea comes to you, and a lot of times it's the what if question, what if this happened or what if that happened? And then you start casting this story in your mind, uh, and then in one sense of the term, the story does exist, and it's your job as the writer to dig it out and to polish it off and to bring the story out of the miry clay that it exists in, and that's the job of the writer. But what is that moment of creation like for you? And is it typical or is every project different?
Well, I've been asked that before, and usually the answer I give is this: that well, for instance, for this book, I know exactly when it started. It started when the British seaman who was my crew member told me the story of the Royal George. That's what started it, and then of course it went through many incarnations and changes. At that point, there, ISIS didn't exist; they weren't taking hostages. Shortly after that, no one was hijacking planes or taking hostages. We hadn't America hadn't fought in the Middle East since World War II, um, and over time, those were added to it in layers of accretion. But what I usually say is this: something will occur to me. Usually, it's the last line of a story or a book. The last line is usually a very beautifully constructed in terms of language. It's beautiful. One line occurs to me, and then I know that that's the last line of whatever it is, the novel, the book, the short story, whatever. And then it's like if you take a stone and you throw it into a lake. You see maybe, I don't know, I can't throw that far anymore, but it lands 100 feet. I don't think probably couldn't even throw 100 feet, 75 feet away into the water, plunk in the water. And then you dive into the water and you swim to get the stone. And that from the point of the shore to where you get the stone, that's the beginning of the book to the end of the book. We're working toward that one line, and that's what gives you the discipline, the subject, the feel, the spirit of the book. The one line at the end. I mean, that's how I do it. I've always done it. And in this book, that worked that way. I mean, the original idea came way back when I was 20, but for the book itself, the very last line occurred to me. And you could, well, I'll tell you what, grab the book, it's right next to you, read the very last line.
The very last line.
Yes.
When she reached the second step from the bottom, he moved toward her. She took his hand and she jumped down like a young girl.
Yep. It took 500 pages to get to that. And and the point is you love that woman who did that. And throughout the whole book, I felt that and worked toward that. Her name is Katie. So,
That's amazing. You said that you had this idea for a long time and you felt like you weren't ready to write this book. And you said on your website that there were things that you needed to accumulate along the way so that you would be capable of writing this book. How did you know that it was now time to tell the story?
I don't know. I actually I wanted to do it even before. I wanted to do it many books ago. I just didn't get around to it. So when I finished the last book, which is called Paris in the Present Tense,
Yeah.
then I said, okay, well now I can write this one. But and by the way, you mentioned how the books were different, and they really are different. I mean, this book is about uh, I hate to say it's about because it's about many things. It's a whole ton of things. Reviewers say everything but the kitchen. But it's the main character is a naval officer and, who is of Dutch extraction, Hudson Valley Dutch. I grew up in the Hudson Valley, and I knew people like that. I'm not by any means. In my school, we were taught the anthem of the Dutch West India Company. I'm not kidding. I mean, that's how old I am. Uh, but so he's a Dutch descended Navy captain from the Hudson Valley. His name is Rensselaer. And the female protagonist is named Katie Farrar. She's a Virginian. And it has a lot of naval action and political action, et cetera, et cetera. The last book, Paris in the Present Tense, was about a Jewish cellist in Paris. The book before that was about somebody in the garment district in New York and an heiress. You can simplify it. I mean, that was a big, long book, and it was about a lot of things. And then I wrote a book called, the previous novel was Freddy and Fredericka, a sort of a Mark Twain type story about Duchess of Wales. And excuse me, not the Duke, she was the Princess of Wales. And then before that, Antproof Case, about what was he? He was also from the Hudson Valley, but he ended up in Brazil. He robbed a bank, ended up in Brazil, and he was obsessed with coffee. And that was after no reviewer understood this. So ridiculous. It's a book by. Have you ever heard of Italo Svevo?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, that's good. And he wrote a book called The Confessions of Zeno. About he's an Italian from believe from Friuli, or anyway from Fiume, which is now in Yugoslavia. It's not even Yugoslavia anymore. I don't know where the hell it is. But this Confessions of Zeno is about a guy who's obsessed with cigarettes. He's addicted to cigarettes, etc. And so, Antproof Case, which I wrote, I'm going on 30 years, believe it or not, was about this guy in Brazil who detests coffee. And he has a reason for it, and in the book it's explained. And then before that was a soldier of the Great War, about an Italian soldier in World War One, and before that was Winterstown. Before that was, the point is that what people want, unfortunately, although not unfortunately for John Grisham and Tom Clancy, is they want a repetition of the same book each time. And so if you write a book and someone says, "Oh, this is really great. I really like this book because I enjoyed it so much," and then you come out with the next book and they want it to be exactly the same with a slight variation. And if you don't do that, they say he betrayed me. I just got let me deal with this.
Sure.
Okay. Do you know what that was? That was a spam call. All the time. They ask for Jerry. So this has been now for about 3 years. Jerry, whoever the hell he was a deadbeat who gave our telephone number. And we get calls all the time from the Philippines, and they say, "Hello, is this Jerry?" And I say, "There's no Jerry who ever lived here. Take us off your list, whatever." My wife reports it to whatever authorities are. It doesn't matter. It's been years they torture us for Jerry. Can I tell you a story? Do we have enough time to tell you? Okay. When I lived in Brooklyn Heights, when I was first married to my wife, my second wife, and we lived in a fifth floor walk-up. It was but Michiko Kakutani, remember her from the New York Times?
Mm-hmm.
She was a young journalist. She came to interview me there and walked in. The first thing she did was criticize the furniture. We saved all our money. My wife is a lawyer. She was a big-time lawyer, but we saved all our money because we knew we had to save it because the future would be a problem. You have to lay in your seed corn, right? So we lived very modestly. And she just criticized the furniture. She was very, very unpleasant. Anyway, I had a landline, and I was sitting there in the apartment writing Winter's Tale. And sometimes it would be freezing. Sometimes it'd be really hot because we were under our roof. And all day long, in one period, the phone would ring. I'd pick it because there was no. We don't even now have voicemail or answering machine. Say hello. And the Board of Education, which was nearby, was advertising for an assistant principal for an elementary school, more than one. And they put an ad in the newspapers, and they said, if you're interested in this position, call this number. And it was my number. So I was getting all these calls from people. So I went to the Board of Education and I said, look, you put this ad in and it has my number. You've got to do something about that. And they said, oh, there's nothing we can do. And I said, well, are you going to run it again? They said, yeah, we're going to run it. And I said, well, call an ad agency and have them change it. No, we can't do that. It'd be much too expensive. I said, but you're not even getting the calls. And they said, well, we're getting something. I said, but I'm getting anyway, they wouldn't do anything. I was really angry about that. So I got all these calls and the people would say, I answered it and I said, hello, Board of Education. And people would say, may I speak to Dr. So-and-so, who was the person that was, and I said, just one moment, please. And I switched and come back and said, oh, this is Dr. So-and-so. And they would say, I'm interested in applying for this position. And I would talk them through it. And I would say, we listed in the paper when the interviews are. But because this is an elementary school position, we're interested in seeing how imaginative you are because you're dealing with young children and we want to stimulate their imaginations. So the chancellor has decided that for these interviews, when you show up, we want you to do the best you can to be dressed as an owl. And so you get it? And the only reason I say that is because this phone rang in the middle of our conversation here. So all these people showed up dressed as owls. I presume that I wasn't there at the Board of Education.
Oh my goodness, that's amazing. Oh, we've got another great question, Mark. You talk about being real and true, yet your work waltzes well outside the lines, what we might call realism. Thank goodness. What do you think about realism versus fantasy? And I would like to tag on that. When you get a story idea, do you know from the beginning that this story is going to venture into like Winter's Tale territory, or how do you know in the writing? Does it just dictate to you that this needs to be a more fantastical type story?
That's also a great question. Tell you what, when I was, see, how was I? I don't know. It was 1972, and I was in the Israeli army, and I read 100 Years of Solitude, and I hated it. I just hated it. And then I was awarded for Winter Tale the World Fantasy Award, and I tried very hard to turn it down, but they wouldn't let me because I don't like fantasy. Now people will say, "What are you crazy? You wrote Winter's Tale, and you say you don't like that?" I don't like fantasy. Here's my question: Is the Inferno, the Divine Comedy, the Commedia, is that fantasy? You would call that fantasy? I wouldn't call it fantasy. Is Virgil fantasy? I wouldn't call that fantasy either. This is in the great literary tradition, which goes back to the beginning of time. We are not necessarily bound by the laws of physics, and it has to do also with religion. In the way that religion has been pretty much from fiction. With religion, we are allowed to entertain things such as in the Bible, pillars of fire, or resurrections, all kinds of things that are not constrained by the laws of physics. And so there's a fine line, there's a fine distinction between fantasy, and I can't necessarily define where that is, but I can feel it, and the allowances that are given to you if you hew to the ancient traditions of literature pre-scientific. In other words, the way that religion does. So yeah, I don't like fantasies. I don't like gnomes and elves and things like that, and dragons and whatever. Although Dante has a dragon called Geryon.
Yes.
Yeah. But I don't. What commonly is called fantasy, I don't like. And a lot of people say when they meet me, will say, "I can't believe that," but it's true. It's true. Um, so that's the answer. The answer is if you look closely at whatever you I don't presume to direct anyone to it, but if you look at what I've written, you can see that very much in the ancient tradition in which the the writers and the bards, Homer even departed from the physical world, the constraints of the physical world, and you could say in order to make a point, metaphorical or whatever. But maybe that's the difference. Maybe the difference is this: if you have something like the Bible or Dante, they are doing that to make a point, not as not to be necessarily believed. For instance, if you look at you read the Commedia, um, I don't think anyone who actually read it ever. It wasn't intended to be believed that he actually descended into hell and was visited by Virgil. You see, it's an allegory. There's a difference between fantasy and allegory. Fantasy is let's drop your objections and just believe it and go with it and be taken up with the story, et cetera, et cetera. With a literary allegory, you don't necessarily believe it. It's used as an illustration. Maybe that's the difference.
Excellent answer. Um, Mark, on your website, for each of your works, you have a great section where you have about the book, reviews, excerpts, backstory, where you talk a little bit about kind of what the thoughts behind the beginning of the story was, and then you've got a thing called beginnings, and for all of them, or at least all of them that I looked at, you have a photo of a handwritten beginning of a manuscript.
Yeah.
Do you write your manuscripts in longhand? And how has your writing changed over the course of your career? Has technology affected the way that you approach storytelling? And what's your process like?
Well, when I first began, yeah, I guess you'd say I was OCDC. No, not OCDC. OCD. OCD. Uh, I'm. I guess I am. And my wife says I am. And I'm just very neat. Always have been. I used to clean up after my parents. When I stay in a hotel, I clean the room before the maid comes in the hotel. Even I carry usually a bottle of Windex and a little tiny thing, especially now if you fly, if you go to 4 houses. I clean the mirror in the bathroom and I wash the soap dish. And I do that because I believe that things should be organized and tidy. So when I was very young, when I began, I always used a Mont Blanc fountain pen because I grew up using fountain pens. When I was in school, we used fountain pens. They did have ballpoints, but they were wax ink. They weren't the rollerball, and they were really crappy to write with. So we all used fountain pens. And my first books were written in fountain pen, and very, very neat, beautifully done. If you look at in that website of Refiner's Fire, you'll see that it's just very, very nice and neat, etc. If you then look at the later books, anything but. Why? Because as I've gotten older, I've developed a tremor. It's called essential tremor. Parkinson's. It's what happens when you get old. And my handwriting is completely, uh, um, but the process has always been the same, which is always write it with. Um, I was once for 6 months, a an internet columnist for the Wall Street Journal. I was a columnist for the Wall Street Journal, print edition. And then when they came out with this thing called Opinion Journal, which was online, they said, we'd like you to also do this. So I tried it for 6 months. I didn't like it. The first column I think that I wrote was called Lament for Paper and Ink. And I think there's magic in paper and ink, really. Uh, and that's how I work. I always have first draft is in pen, and now I use rollerball pens because of my hammer and to do that. And it's not neat at all, as you can see if you look at those things. But then I do have colored pens. Go over it. The first draft is with a black pen. The second draft is also with a black pen. Strangely enough, I don't know why I do this, but I do it. It's the third draft is with a red pen. Fourth draft is with a green pen, a blue pen, and the fifth draft is with green pen. At that point, that's 5 drafts on the same, usually on the same paper. Then I put it on a word processor, and then I do the subsequent draft on the word processor. I got a word processor in 1981. I was one of the first ones to do it. In publishing, they didn't really go to word processing for another 15 or 20 years. I was always, believe it or not, I was pushing them, and I didn't know what I was doing because it got too much, with all the new technology and. But that's how I would do it. To everyone who wants to be writing, I would say there is such a pleasure in writing with your hand and on a piece of paper. For me, anyway, it's been my life, and I love it.
Well, one thing that's interesting is in the modern writing era, if that first draft is done in a word processor, the subsequent drafts are usually edits of that originally typed manuscript. So you're not actually rewriting the book as you are just editing, line editing, if
Yeah,
you will.
well, that's
But the way you do
that's
it,
what
you're
I'm.
actually rewriting the
No,
book, which
no,
is
no,
coming up
no,
a loss.
no. I'm not. I'm not.
Okay.
It's editing, but very
Okay.
savage. I mean, really extensive editing. But
Gotcha.
no, I don't. I don't sit down with a blank piece of paper and then start rewriting it. No, I wouldn't do that. That would. It would take 10 years, more than 20 years to do. It's when I say draft, I mean going thoroughly over it.
I
I
understand. Okay.
understand.
Gotcha.
Gotcha.
The new book is called The Oceans and the Stars, a sea story, a war story, a love story. It publishes in October, but we're going to put links to it in the show notes where you can pre-order it now and go ahead and reserve your copy. Mark, this has been so much fun chatting and going over your career. Thank you so much for taking time to join us. If people want to dig into all of the amazing work that you have accumulated, is your website the best place for people to
Yeah.
find all of that collected in one place?
Yes, not Wikipedia because well, it's so many mistakes in it. It's ridiculous. The website is a good summation. It's not an active website. I don't participate in it. I don't put new things in it. It's like a reference. And I have a bibliography there, and I have each book is laid out if they can they want to. But yes, I agree with you. This has been a lot of fun, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. We will put links in the show notes to make it easy for folks to find your website as well as to pre-order the book. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
You're welcome. Thanks. Bye.